I've always been a skeptic. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or any type of supernatural phenomenon. Or at least I didn't. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my worldview changed, forced by the strangest and most terrifying circumstances I've ever lived through. It was a regular Tuesday. The sun was beginning to set, casting orange hues across the sky as I returned to my apartment in Manhattan, tired after a long day at work. When I arrived, I noticed something unusual. A large, worn-out box waiting for me at the door. I thought it was odd because I didn't remember ordering anything. I looked at the label and saw my name printed correctly, along with my apartment address. With my heart racing from a strange curiosity, I brought the box inside. It was heavier than I expected. I placed it on the floor of my living room and stared at it for a few moments, trying to imagine who could have sent it. There was no sender listed, just a postal stamp indicating it came from somewhere in the countryside. The muffled sounds of traffic outside seemed distant, and for a moment, the world around me went silent. I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully opened the box. When the flaps lifted, what I saw made my heart stop for a moment. Inside, wrapped in an old dusty cloth, was a doll. But not just any doll. It was the doll. The same one I had as a child, at my grandmother's house in rural Massachusetts. The smiling face and large glassy eyes seemed to watch my every move, just as they had decades ago. In that moment, a mix of nostalgia and discomfort washed over me. How was that doll here? The last time I saw it was the day my parents sold my grandmother's house, shortly after her death. Since then, it had never reappeared, and I honestly thought it had been thrown out along with other old things from the house. But there it was, in perfect condition, as if no time had passed. Who would have sent this? I lifted the doll slowly, and a flood of childhood memories hit me. I used to spend long summers at my grandmother's house. I remember playing in the garden, running through the hallways, and most importantly, my obsession with that doll. I called her Molly. And the strange thing was, she wasn't just a toy to me. I talked to her as if she were a real person. Stranger still, I always felt like she responded. My parents never understood my friendship with Molly. They thought it was just a lonely child's imagination, but I knew it was more than that. Molly seemed alive. Of course, I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. At least that's what I thought until that moment. I sat on the couch with the doll in my lap, staring at it. My fingers traced its clothes, still intact, and a shiver ran down my spine. For some irrational reason, I decided to keep her. I don't know if it was out of nostalgia or just a spur-of-the-moment decision, but I placed Molly on a shelf in my bedroom. And that's when everything started to fall apart. That same night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like tiny footsteps, as if someone were walking slowly. The sound stopped abruptly when I got up to investigate. I found nothing except for the heavy, suffocating silence that filled the apartment. I shook my head, laughing at myself. It's all good, Sarah. It's probably just the building settling, I thought, trying to calm my nerves. But the noises continued. Night after night, every time I laid my head on the pillow, the footsteps returned, always from the hallway, always from the same spot. I began to get paranoid, unable to sleep properly. Sometimes I felt a presence watching me, as if someone were standing at the door, just looking at me. The situation escalated in the third week, when something happened that I couldn't ignore. I woke up in the middle of the night with the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. I turned to the side, and my heart nearly stopped. Molly was lying next to me on the bed. Her glassy eyes seemed darker, as if they had absorbed all the light from the room. I hadn't put her there. I jumped out of bed, feeling a rush of fear, and threw her to the floor. I stood, panting, watching the doll lying motionless on the carpet, as if she had never moved. I wanted to believe it was just a dream, but the image of her beside me was too vivid to be my imagination. In the following nights, more strange things began to happen. Lights flickered, objects moved, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started hearing whispers coming from the hallway, and sometimes a low, childish giggle that made my blood run cold. Every part of me wanted to get rid of that doll, but something stronger kept stopping me. It was as if Molly had some sort of hold over me, an invisible force that kept me tied to her. I went to an antique shop, hoping someone there could help me figure out the origin of the doll and maybe find a rational explanation for what was happening. The shopkeeper, an elderly man, looked at the doll with a serious expression when I showed it to him. He didn't want to touch it, but he said something that chilled me to the bone. The man at the antique shop, an old gentleman with white hair and wrinkled skin, looked at me in a way that made my stomach sink. He didn't want to get near Molly, nor did he want to touch her. He just observed the doll with eyes that seemed aged by time and perhaps by fear. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I quickly explained how I had received the box and my history with the doll as a child, leaving out the more bizarre details of the past few weeks. He listened in silence, but something in his gaze hardened when I mentioned my grandmother and the time I spent with the doll in my childhood. When I finished, he looked at me in a way that sent a chill down my spine. "You should get rid of it," he murmured, not taking his eyes off Molly. "Old dolls sometimes have a history of their own. And this one doesn't seem to be here by chance." I laughed a bit nervously. "What do you mean, not here by chance?" The man sighed and stepped back a few paces. He seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether to continue talking or not. But finally he relented. "Many cultures believe that dolls can be vessels of energy. Some good, others not so much." He paused and I felt a chill. "Your grandmother, did she know that? Was her house by any chance different?" The question caught me off guard. I had never thought of my grandmother's house that way, but now that he mentioned it, a few memories began to surface. There were parts of the house that always made me uncomfortable. The basement, for example, where my grandmother kept many of her old things, was a place I avoided, and sometimes I saw shadows that shouldn't have been there. But I was a child. I was sure it was just my imagination. "I don't know," I replied, trying to push away the unsettling memories. "My grandmother was always very private, but I don't remember anything truly strange." He looked at me as if he knew more than he was willing to say. "Just be careful. Objects like that can bring things back. Things you might not want to come back." I left the shop with a heavy feeling on my shoulders. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, but despite the growing fear, I still couldn't bring myself to get rid of the doll. Something in me resisted, as if part of me didn't want to let her go. In the following days, the supernatural events became more intense. Molly was never where I left her. I would place her on the shelf before bed, but I'd wake up to find her in unexpected places. On the couch, in the kitchen, even in the bathroom. One night, I woke up and saw her standing in the doorway of my bedroom, staring directly at me. Though she hadn't moved a single inch of her body, I could feel her presence, heavy and suffocating, as if she had a will of her own. Lights flickered erratically, doors slammed for no reason, and I began to feel watched all the time. I woke up every night at exactly 3:03 a.m., with no apparent cause, with the feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed. There was no rest, and each day I seemed more exhausted, both mentally and physically. Friends and co-workers noticed my deteriorating appearance, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding insane. Then one night something terrifying happened. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the footsteps coming from the hallway, something that had become part of my nightly routine, when I heard a new sound. It was a whisper, soft and disturbing, like a child singing a forgotten melody. The sound was so faint at first that I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized the words were clear enough for me to understand. "Come play with me, Sarah." Froze. The voice wasn't my imagination. It was coming from inside my bedroom. Slowly, I turned to look around, my heart pounding like a drum. And there was Molly, sitting on the chair next to my bed, her head slightly tilted, as if she were watching me. Fear consumed me. I jumped out of bed and ran out of the room, feeling my body tremble. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I thought might understand what was happening: my mother. When she answered, I heard her confused voice on the other end of the line. I didn't know how to start, so I blurted everything out. The doll, the noises, the inexplicable movements, the voice. When I finished, there was a worrying silence on the other end. "Sarah," my mother finally said, her voice sounding older than I remembered. "I never wanted to tell you this, but I think it's time. Your grandmother. She had secrets, things no one in the family knew. The doll Molly. She wasn't an ordinary toy. Your grandmother. She did things, rituals. She believed the doll protected the house and whoever was in it. But after she died, we thought it best to get rid of everything." My heart raced. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" "Because I wanted to protect you, sweetheart. I didn't want you to be scared. But it seems the doll has found its way back to you." My blood ran cold. "What do I do now?" My mother sighed deeply. "There is a way to end this, but you're not going to like it." She explained that I needed to burn the doll. It was the only way to stop what my grandmother had started. But there was a problem. Molly wouldn't let it happen easily. She was more than just an object. She had fed off something, perhaps the years of fear and energy I had felt near her. The bond between us was strong, and breaking it would be painful. That night, I decided I would do whatever it took to end this nightmare. I set up an impromptu fireplace on the building's rooftop, far from everything, and placed Molly inside. When I lit the fire, a piercing scream echoed through the air, as if the doll itself were alive and feeling pain. I stood there, watching as the flames consumed the porcelain body. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. However, when it was all over and the fire had died out, I saw something in the ashes. A piece of Molly's dress, untouched by the flames. And at that very moment I heard once again the voice of a child whispering in the wind. "You can't get rid of me that easily, Sarah."